This week on Supercars Torque, I try to come up for a new nickname for Shane van Gisbergen and fail. Talk about Dunlop tyres, Gen 3 complaints, and what's happening in the co-driver market. After Sandown, it was found that the Terminator, or Shane van Gisbergen, as he was commonly known previously, not only had a broken collarbone, but he also had 3 broken ribs. Apparently, this wasn't found until he had some x-rays done to check out if he'd done any more damage to the collarbone after Sandown, and they found the broken ribs afterwards. I would have thought that this would have been a common thing, but having a shoulder injury of my own recently, they did only just kind of do the x-ray of the shoulder, didn't worry about ribs or anything. I don't think I've got any trouble with ribs. I haven't had any trouble breathing or anything. On my shoulder injury too, I have got some movement. Don't ask me to move it too much higher than that though. And I have been driving, but I use my left arm a lot. So yeah, I'm still wondering how Shane must have had some really good painkillers in there if his pain was anything like me. But yeah, just to add to the spectacularness of what he did at Sandown, 3 broken ribs as well as a busted shoulder, and just absolute domination that weekend. Speaking of Sandown, once again it has been brought up about the quality of the Dunlop wet tyres. It seems that they've all come from the same batch, but it seems that the way these tyres get stored does bring up some interesting inconsistencies between some of the tyre sets. Now, what I was a little bit surprised about, the teams, apparently these tyres were all made in 2019, I think, and over time teams have bought them. With there being no wet racing last year, teams didn't actually need to use any of the tyres, and that's why this batch is effectively so old. But a lot of teams, from what I understand, they use the wet tyres to store the cars on when they're putting them in and out of the transporter and that. So you could imagine that, a set of wets from last year has been, I can just imagine the temperature kind of up and down in those trucks, especially because they weren't at their base all of last year, so they would have been on the road a lot more. So the compound kind of goes hard the more it's exposed to the elements, and there's been some disparity between the sets. Now, maybe some of the teams at the front of the field with a bigger budget could go and buy as many brand new sets as they wanted for Sandown. Maybe some of the other teams, we'll use the tyres that have been sat in the transporter for 12, 18 months. Dunlop has said, well, they were all built at the same time, they're all the same. So, it's a very tough one. An easy way, I suppose, of managing it is that Dunlop holds all the tyres that you use over the weekend, and then you don't get these issues. Apparently, they used to put batch numbers on the side of the tyre, and Dunlop doesn't do that anymore, so that it doesn't matter. You can't trace the batches that they came from, although as far as I know, they all still have the normal barcodes on them that the Dunlop tyres have, so that Dunlop can track them. But then also you'd go, oh, well, you've already got 10 wet tyres or whatever. You can't go and buy another 50 this weekend. So I'm not sure how to provide a solution to this. It could be maybe like F1, where you have a set of tyres that are rock hard or whatever, that are just there to transport the car around. Well, they don't actually have them, but for the filming days and stuff, the F1 guys get special set of tyres. So maybe you have like a storage set of tyres, and then when there is a wet weekend, Dunlop just sells the tyres then ready to go, so they're all stored in the same truck, in the same conditions, so there's no questioning. The big example, because a lot of people were complaining about it, and then if you remember back to the weekend, Brody's strategy, they went really long in the race before stopping, and that was apparently because in qualifying, they'd kind of realised that, hey, one of these sets is really good and one of these sets is shocking. So they started him on the good set and just went as long as possible before they put on the shocking set, because they figured that was going to be the best yield for the race rather than, spending half the race on a crappy set of tyres. Probably as the margins get smaller and smaller and smaller between everybody, it's maybe something that needs to be looked at so that we don't get this complaining, because it's only going to get louder and louder every time there is a wet race. This week it was announced that Dean Fiore is going to partner Todd Hazelwood in the Enduros. This means there are not many seats up for grabs, 6 under my count, and 2 of them we probably already know who's going to be in those seats. So the 6 seats still available is at Techno Team Sydney. We can assume that Jono Webb is going to take one of those seats. And I have heard that Alex Davison will be in the other seat if he is not needed to partner Will. Matt Stone Racing has 2 seats up for grabs. Kurt Kostecki should be in with his brother, and Aaron Seaton is probably going to fill the second one. The seat next to Jack Smith, the Smith's license, that's one a little bit up in the air. They have got Josh Fife and Jordan Boys sniffing around, and Dean Canto's still kind of there or thereabouts with that team. So that's probably the most open seat of all of them. And no one has been signed to partner Jaime yet. With everything that's going on, we can only assume that Rick Kelly will be taking that seat. Then what's leading me more and more to think that Triple Eight will be running a wild card, because Brock Feeney has not got a seat and he's not really in the frame for any of the seats that are available. And part of me just thinks, how can he not have a seat if people are actually considering him to replace Jamie Whincup next year? So I think we will see a wild card at Bathurst from at least Triple Eight, and I have heard that there is potentially a couple more in the pipeline. More of that to come as we get details further on. This week has been a little bit of a slow news week. There is, of course, the whole Brisbane getting locked down that may potentially affect things, but we are still a couple of weeks out from Tasmania. I'd be a bit more worried if I was somewhat involved with the Bathurst 6 Hour. Not going to get into any more of this lockdown stuff this week, though, because it's boring me to death. But I did notice there was a lot of stories this week about Gen 3 stuff, and it seems to be stories a bit inflaming comment sections on Bookface and things like that. There was a story about the pedal shifts, which is always a big one that gets people riled up. Hybrids, people get so excited about the hybrid stuff, and I see so many comments about people saying, oh, well, I don't watch F1 anymore because it doesn't sound any good. Well, you don't want to watch F1 because Lewis Hamilton's going to win every race. Their sandbagging didn't seem to be as good this year, going off round 1, but they did end up still winning. The sound of F1 wasn't so much because they went hybrid. It was more because they went to a turbo engine that is essentially a massive muffler, and the engines are very efficient, and noise is really efficiency escaping. There's a whole sciencey kind of thing to it and that, and I don't quite understand everything, but apparently the louder it is, the less efficient it is, essentially. So let's get some less efficient engines into F1. Um, the other story, which was actually one that really grabbed my attention, though, was that it's looking like your typical engine shops like Kelly's, Walkinshaw, Tickford are probably not going to get to make their own engines next year, and we're probably going to see a KRE, who does the engines currently for Triple Eight and Brad Jones Racing, and in turn I think they do Techno and Matt Stone Racing, and then Mostec, who is the engine supplier to DJR. It's looking increasingly likely those two companies are just going to produce the engines, and then if you're running a Camaro, you have to go to KRE to buy an engine. If you're running a Mustang, you have to go to Mostec to buy an engine. Where this was where the whole V6 twin turbo thing from Holden fell apart, because the teams like Walkinshaw and Erebus didn't want to have to go to KRE to go and buy their engines. They said, why are we paying someone to do something we can do ourselves? From a category and cost standpoint, I think this is a great idea. As I said, I'm more than happy to have a big Supercars truck of parts turn up at the track. And if you need an extra engine, you just go with your credit card and pay your, however, 20, 30, 40, 50 grand or whatever to buy a new engine because you've had a blow up and your gearbox breaks, so you go and buy another one or whatever. Just then the teams have to carry a minimum amount of spares around. They don't have to have heaps and heaps and heaps. So you don't have this massive inventory of spares. Essentially, Supercars carries it around, and barring any like Tasmania 2017, was it, where the whole field basically took each other out, you know, on that wet day. Basically, any disasters like that, you're pretty much covered. You think about Sandown, you know, I think there's a couple of engine changes and, you know, a few panels, but you're going to carry panels anyway, and team might carry one spare engine, but it means you don't have to have, you know, a multitude of these kind of spares. You can just go to the truck and buy them. But then on the flip side of that is you've got this industry that's geared up where you've got all these teams that have their own engine shops, and then what do? So they might be able to get, a few of them might be able to get a job with one of the new suppliers, because that's a lot of engines to build in a short amount of time. Like, there's going to be a lot of chassis that have to be built before the start of next year. So, yeah. Time is ticking on this Gen 3, which is probably the bigger issue than worrying about whether they have paddle shifts or hybrids at the moment, because they ain't going to have hybrids next year. That's not going to happen for next year. Yeah. Down in the comments, tell me what you think about, you know, the kind of single supplier, or maybe, you know, one or two suppliers for all of these parts. Who do you think is going to fill the last few co-driver seats? Have you got a better nickname for Shane van Gisbergen other than the Terminator? Do you have a solution for what we do with the Dunlop tyres? Easter coming up this week. It is exciting. I have a special little gift. I'll probably put that out on Friday. Just a little something different to go with a series that I started doing. Until next time, I'm still Dave, and I'll catch you later.